I've had a little Prova fan heater from the 1950s for a while, and during lockdown, finding it so loud that I couldn't hear myself think while using it, I decided, as I loved the look of the thing, that I would attempt to upcycle it into something even louder: a guitar amplifier. Giving it a new purpose, learning something along the way, and making it more than just a sentimental relic that I would have just chucked away. Here's how I did it. I acquired the following items: a 6.5-inch Jensen C6V speaker, a Vox MV50 Rock Mini amplifier head, some loudspeaker cable, valve radio knobs for D-shaped 1/4 inch pot shafts to replace the amp knobs and match the look of the fan, and two Switchcraft 1/4 inch jack sockets. Of course, not being an amp builder or electronics expert in any way, I found this was not all I needed, but more about that later. Approaching with gusto, I began to remove the fan parts inside the chassis. I took out the fan and motor, the heater elements, and their casing and the wiring that went with them. I was left with this: the power cabling and light, and the heater control knob affixed to a greatly reduced housing. I had previously eyed the measurements of the amp head and had planned to put the controls on the front. However, this is when I encountered the first snag. Well, two snags really. Firstly, having checked how the speaker fit the hole, I noticed that it was almost exactly the same size as the hole, so the screw holes had nothing to screw into. I realised that I would need to mount the speaker onto a piece of ply, so I made a template of the chassis with a smaller speaker hole. I used a 6mm ply. I then thought I would take out the light at the front of the fan and use this for the 1/4 inch jack socket, which was easy enough to do. Before going any further, I decided I'd better check out the MV50 to make sure it would fit at the front. When I did this, I realised the MV50 was just a little bit too big to fit without coming into direct contact or getting in the way of the speaker, so I thought perhaps I could take it apart, extending the pot so I could still have the controls at the front. I removed the lid and immediately took off the little handle, as all this was doing was taking up space. I then started looking at whether I could disassemble it easily, but found it too tightly put together and didn't want to disrupt anything. I gave in and decided I would have a rethink of how to orientate the whole Vox unit. I put the light cover back on the fan chassis to retain the original look and decided to mount the MV50 on the side instead. I fit the speaker to the ply template with M4 nuts and bolts and soldered the loudspeaker wire to the speaker, positive to positive, negative to negative. I then connected the other ends of the speaker wire to one of the Switchcraft 1/4 inch jack sockets to the corresponding positive and negative sides. I then soldered another cable to the same positive and negatives on that jack socket to another Switchcraft 1/4 inch jack socket. This created firstly a direct out for the MV50 to plug into the speaker, then a second speaker out to plug into a second speaker cabinet if I want to. Next, I marked where the MV50 would attach to have the controls on the side, drawing around the MV50 chassis and marking the screw holes. I also marked the holes for the control knobs on the side of the fan chassis. I popped the speaker inside the fan chassis and hooked it up to the stylophone, and here's how it sounded. I then hooked it up to the MV50 to test the sound. I made sure the impedance on the MV50 matched the speaker, which is 8 ohms. So far, so good. I drilled the holes for the knobs, VU meter and jack input of the MV50 in the side of the chassis. In order to stop the ply speaker template rattling around inside the fan chassis, I added some extra insulation using some old floor soundproofing insulation foam. I drilled a hole in the centre of the back of the fan chassis for the power lead to fit through, as I found the old power lead hole was already the perfect size for the speaker out socket, and the new power lead hole needed to be bigger. I also drilled the holes for mounting the MV50 inside and then put it all together. Notice here the extremely stupid mistake. I didn't put any insulation on a steel chassis. When I turned the amp on to test it, the speaker started making a pulsing popping noise. I realised something was up. I switched off the MV50, removed the speaker out jack and tested it again. Now it sounded fine. I realised what happened was that I had created some kind of electric current loop, as the steel was acting as a conductor between the amp head and the speaker out. So I insulated the speaker out and the amplifier connection to the chassis with plenty of insulation tape inside and out, and this seemed to do the trick. My next problem came when I put it all together, adding the chassis. The control knob holes were okay in size, but the knobs wouldn't stay on the pot shafts because of the thickness of the chassis. I decided I would have to cut one big hole to allow the knobs to work freely. I did this and put it all back together, adding the original grille, slipping it in between the chassis and the foam. This is how it looked with the big control hole cut out. Really ugly. It solved the access issue, but completely ruined the look. I added a rubber washer to the power lead hole in order to stop the chassis cutting into it. You can see the insulation tape here too. To fix the aesthetic issue with the control knobs, I made a 3mm ply template which I painted with metallic paint. I Gorilla Glued it on the back to the chassis, then siliconed around the edges. Feeling that the power lead hole looked actually quite ugly, I removed the rubber washer and replaced it with a 16mm rubber grommet, which adds better protection and is much nicer to look at. I like how in the end I mostly preserved the original look of the amp. I retained the little feet at the front too, as you can adjust the height of the amp to direct it a little bit. One glaring issue, however, of course, is the lack of power switch on the back, as I didn't want to ruin the circuit board on the MV50. To make sure I can still turn the amp head on and off, I devised a little S-hook so I can reach inside and switch the MV50 on and off, pushing and pulling as necessary. Now, let's hear it. So there's the volume, there's the tone.